Okay. Uh, the next part is on the kinds of obligations. There are two kinds of obligations, pero before we discuss that, let's go back to the definition of obligations under 1156, Article 1156 ng New Civil Code. Now, under Article 1156, dun sa kaliwa nyo, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Now, there are, kung tatignan nyo dyan, yung to give, to do, or not to do, di ba tatlo yan? Actually, that is reflected in the kinds of obligations that there are. There are generally two kinds of obligations. We have real obligation. In a real obligation, yun yung to give doon sa 1156. A real obligation in a real obligation, the subject matter is a thing which the obligor must deliver to the obligee. Ano yung obligee and obligor? Parang ano lang din yan. Debtor creditor. Si obligor, pwede na natin siyang tawagin doon sa kabila kanina na passive subject. Doon sa si obligee ang active subject. So, in a real obligation, ang subject matter or ang object or prestation ng obligation ay to give something, to deliver something. For example, yung dyan sa example natin dyan, X binds himself to deliver a dog to Y. So, dyan, parang ano ang object or prestation dyan? To give or to deliver a dog, di ba? To deliver a dog. So that is giving. That makes it a real obligation. Now, as opposed to a real obligation, sa personal obligation naman, the subject matter is an act to be done or not to be done. Sa personal obligation, dyan naman yung papasok yung to do or not to do doon sa definition ng obligation kanina. Personal obligations can be further subdivided into two kinds, the positive and negative personal obligation. Actually, sorry about this, about the handout that I'm flashing now, pero I will be changing it doon na lang sa website. But positive personal obligation is actually the obligation to give, to do. Kasi nga sa real obligation yung to give, So here in positive personal obligation, the subject matter or the object or the object or prestation of the obligation is to give, it is to do something, Na example dyan ay C binds himself to repair the cell phone of D. So that's a positive personal obligation in the sense that the obligation is to do something, or in this case to repair the cell phone of D. That is a positive personal obligation. While in a negative personal obligation or an obligation not to do something, basically you are prohibiting someone to do something, Example dyan, A binds himself not to create a window in his wall so as not to disturb the privacy of his neighbors. Dyan, the object or prestation of the obligation is not to create a not to create a window in his wall. Para daw di maistorbo yung privacy ng mga kapitbahay. So you can see here that it is a positive personal obligation kung the object or prestation of the obligation is to do, while negative personal obligation siya kapag it is not to do. So mahalagang alam natin yung distinction between positive personal obligation and positive negative personal obligation, because later on this will have very different rules altogether. So those are the kinds of obligations. We have real obligation, for obligation to or the obligation to give, personal obligation, or the right to, or the obligation to do or not to do. Again, sorry dito sa about the mistake there in the handout, but yeah. So let's try to figure out the example dito sa baba in order to summarize our learnings dito sa lesson na to, So you are in a catering business. So caterer ka. You entered into a contract with X, yung customer, to cater to her son's 7th birthday celebration. Now, actually, if you will dissect this, there are two obligations here. Yung before the party, the obligation is on you as the caterer. The caterer has the obligation to provide the services. Paggawa siguro ng invitation, pag-arrange ng venue, pag-invite ng guest, etc. So in this case, you are the one bound to fulfill the obligation. So you are the passive subject. Ikaw yung dapat mag-fulfill ng obligasyon mo on this matters, So before ng birthday, ikaw ang diyan. Ikaw ang in charge. So you will have to fulfill your obligation to X. X is the active subject kasi siya yung entitled na mag-demand na i-fulfill mo yung obligasyon mo. Meaning, siya yung he or she is entitled na sabihin sa'yo na, oh, gawin mo to, etc. Based doon sa napag-usapan nyo in the contract. Now, yung object or prestation or yung subject matter dito is to cater the birthday of yung anak ni X. So that is what? That is an obligation to do, tama? So since it is an obligation to do, it is what we call a personal obligation. Now, is it positive or negative? Since ang gagawin mo is you actually have to do something, it is a positive personal obligation. Now, what ties you? What is the legal tie between you and X? So the legal tie there is the contract that you entered into. Now, the second aspect of that contract is that after the birthday, tapos na lahat. Ibig sabihin nun, you were already done fulfilling your obligation. So what's next? Who has the obligation now? The obligation now, well, ideally, is X to pay naman. So that is the presumption is the payment is after everything is done, pero in some cases money first or partial, mga ganyan. But in the presumption in this case is that the presumption in this case is that after the party saka ka lang babayaran. So in this case, X is the passive subject in a sense na siya na yung dapat mag-fulfill ng kanyang obligation to pay. Tama? So obligation to pay yun. So in this case naman, you are the active subject in a sense that you are the one who you can say, hey, bayaran mo na ako. You are the one entitled to the fulfillment of the obligation. Ikaw na yung pwedeng maningil sa kanya. Now, the object or the payment of the catering fee is the object or prestation. Now, what is that? Is that a real obligation or personal obligation? Well, it is a real obligation because he has to give you something. That is money, right? So that is a real obligation. And again, the tie here is the juridical tie. The juridical tie rather is the contract between you and X. So, sabi dyan, take note, Whoever has the right to demand is the active subject. Kung sino ang pwede mag-demand ng fulfillment ng obligation, siya ang active subject in that case. So, what is this? What source of obligation is this? Obviously, this is a contract. So, sana malinaw sa atin yung malinaw sa atin yung concept ng obligation in general. So, what we learned today is yung obligations, what would the definition of obligation under Article 1156, the definition of obligation, the sources, and the kinds of obligation. There are four requisites of obligation. We have passive subject, active subject, object or prestation, and the juridical type. There are likewise there are five sources of obligation. We have law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delicts, and quasi-delicts. And there are two kinds of obligations. We have real obligations and personal obligations. Real obligations are obligations to give, while personal obligations are obligations to do or not to do. Now, based on that, there are two sub-classifications of personal obligations. We have positive personal obligation, or the obligation to give, and the negative personal obligation. The there are two kinds of personal obligations. We have positive personal obligations, or the obligations to do. Sorry, I keep referring to this mistake here. Positive personal obligation and negative personal obligation, or not to do. So, pag to give something, real. Kapag to do something, personal. Okay? So, for next meeting, we will be discussing the other topics on obligations. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you read the required materials for this subject. If you have questions, you can always ask in our MS Teams, or in the video itself, or through Facebook Messenger. So, thank you and good afternoon.